Why, hello, my loves, and welcome back to Spook Manor. Are you here for another tasty tale? This week, we will be talking about the Black-Eyed Children. Have you heard of them? They are a scattered group of seemingly paranormal kids who appear to be between the ages of 6 and 16. These so-called children tend to knock on the doors of your home or vehicle requesting entry. Often they will relay a plea for help in order to gain your trust. There are many terrifying tales of people who wisely refuse to assist these beings, only to find the decision most likely saved their lives. But what happens if you do welcome these children in? Allow me to introduce you to Jennifer, who found out the hard way while vacationing in the northern woodlands. Influenced by a broken mother's heart, she was among the very few who made the wrong decision and survived to tell the tale. Jennifer was in her mid-40s when her and her young adult daughter had a falling out. Against Jennifer's wishes, her daughter dropped out of college and ran off with some deadbeat boyfriend, cutting all ties with her parents to travel cross-country in a ratty old van. Jennifer knew it would be months, if not years, before she would be seeing her daughter again. To add agony to this already heartbreaking situation, the day after her daughter's dramatic departure, she found her husband of 25 years had left her for a much younger woman. And if that wasn't enough to add insult to injury, the jerk took her little dog too. As she stood alone in her kitchen, grieving the loss of her 2 babies and having to face the sudden shock of betrayal, the horror began to consume her. Slowly listening to the ticking clock, her inner panic became overwhelming. It was almost too much for her to bear. Having recently retired, by choice, from many years as a high school teacher, she knew what to watch for when it came to mental health. While the thoughts of suicide slipped in and out of her mind, she knew a much better alternative would be to get away, to a place where she could think. A place far away from all of the reminders of her failed life. It was then that she remembered an Airbnb she had been eyeing for about a year now. She fantasized of escaping there many times, particularly after nasty fights with her now ex-husband, and felt it would be the perfect place for her to heal. And so, she booked the quiet little one-bedroom cabin, where she could sit without interruption and write the children's book she had always dreamed of. The description of the residence boasted the cabin sat high upon a mountain top, with excellent views, nestled miles and miles away from the nearest dwelling, and cozied up next to a small creek in the backyard. It was the dead of winter, with heavy snow coating the landscape, and this Airbnb was exactly what she was looking for. Upon booking the cabin for a month, she made a mad dash to the grocery store before making the grueling drive out of town. And grueling it was. As she drove up the mountain switchbacks and winding roads, the snow gently began to fall. She had to be extra careful to watch for ice on the roadway, and to watch for deer as well, for which there were many. The sky was overcast, but the sun was still bright in places. Despite leaving in the earliest hours of the morning, Jennifer was relieved to have arrived at the cabin just before nightfall, in high hopes of catching the spectacular sunset views. As she stood outside of her vehicle to unload, the silence of the snow was deafening. Not a single thing moved. Not a bird in sight. Or animal prints on the ground. There was a code for the keypad, and she would not be needing to meet with a host for entry. Jennifer was all alone up here, and that's exactly the way she wanted it. Despite the gentle fear now trickling up her spine. The silence was so consuming that Jennifer was forced to have to listen to her own thoughts. After several hours had passed, it seemed that no matter how she tried to push the negative memories away, they aggressively made their way back into her mind. Soon, she turned on music to drown out the voices in her head and continued nestling into her surroundings. The first couple of days in the cabin were a nice breath of fresh air compared to her troubled existence back at home. At times she would think, this isn't so bad being alone. Maybe I'll be just fine. And As quickly as this thought took hold, her insecurities would wave through. Old movies on her laptop seemed to work best for a distraction, though as soon as the silence filled the room at the end of each movie, her negative reality would penetrate her mind once more. On day 5, Jennifer decided, it's time to start doing something productive. She had not seen a single living thing for days, which was strange to her after witnessing so many deer on her first day's drive. She was starting to get desperate for a little company, though wasn't quite ready to talk with friends or loved ones about her circumstance. And so she decided to make some company of her own, by way of writing her children's book. The snow was coming down heavily. The sky was dark, and the dense, freezing fog wrapped itself around the cabin. The creeping cold made its way in, despite the false fireplace heater running at full blast. Wrapped in a fleece blanket and with a piping hot cup of coffee, Jennifer sat down excitedly. She was ready to make a name for herself and show the world that she would not be broken. But as eager as she was to start, writer's block took hold. This cold weather is freezing my brain, she thought, while sitting back in her creaking wooden desk chair, wishing she had chosen Hawaii instead. Holding the coffee to her face, she let the steam fill her nose with a sensual aroma. Quietly she fell into a relaxed meditation, floating through her imagination in search of an inspirational tale. When all of a sudden, a large branch fell upon the roof in a loud crash. Jennifer nearly fell out of her chair as she spilled the hot liquid all over herself. Letting out a curse word, unfitting for any children's book, she stood up and made her way to the separate bedroom. As she changed her sweater, a gentle rhythmic tapping came from the living room. Just more branches or falling snow, she thought, and after a couple of seconds, she heard the same 3 taps again. That sounds like a person. Or maybe a mouse? She questioned herself. A mouse? What a perfect character for my story, she cried aloud. Quickly, she rushed back to her computer to write. Then she heard the gentle knocking again, a little louder this time, and the faint voice of a young girl followed. Can you help us? Jennifer froze, not believing what she just heard. Slowly, she turned to look out the window. The sky was so dark. At least 2 feet of snow had fallen in the last 2 hours. There is no way anyone could be up here, she whispered to herself and turned back to her computer. Then the knocking came again. This time, the child's voice was a little louder. Please help us. Can we come in? We can't come in unless you let us. Please help. This is impossible, Jennifer whispered to herself as she slowly got up from her chair. She could see 2 small silhouette figures standing on the other side of the glass-paneled wooden front door. Creeping her way over, she asked, "Who is it?" as she peered through the beveled glass for a better look. It was definitely 2 children standing there. But even in the dreary daylight, she could not make out their faces. Even turning on the porch light didn't help, as the bulb had suddenly burst in her attempt to turn it on. "What do you want?" Jennifer asked when there was no answer. "Please, let us in. We need to call our parents. We are lost. Let us in," the girl called out again in a monotone voice. "I'll call your parents for you. What is their number?" Jennifer asked. She had a bad feeling and was starting to grow more concerned. "Let us in. We are cold," the little girl calmly stated. When Jennifer cracked the door open, she noticed the girl had to be about 12, and she had a younger brother of about 7 or 8. The girl had short curly blonde hair and long bangs covering her eyes. She stood in a 50s-style Easter dress, entirely unfitting for the freezing temperatures. The young blonde boy with her was not in much better shape, as he stood in a white dress shirt and black shorts, also matching the vintage era as his sister. "Oh my gosh!" Jennifer exclaimed when she realized their dire need to escape the harsh weather. Come in," she cried out to them in panic, despite her feelings of uneasiness. "You will catch your death out there dressed like that. Where are your parents?" Oddly stiff, The two children entered the tiny cabin. They should be shivering, but they weren't. They should be blue, or showing some signs of exposure to the extreme conditions, but they didn't. They didn't even act cold at all. A sudden chill ran down Jennifer's spine. Something wasn't right. "Here are some warm blankets," she said before also offering them a hot beverage. They said nothing, only stared off blankly. "Here, let me call your parents. What is their number?" Jennifer asked again, grabbing her phone. When they did not respond, she turned to look at them closer. As though someone had just walked on her grave, Jennifer fell silent. Intense fear pulsating through her veins as she realized that both children's eyes were black as crow feathers. She stood with white-knuckle grip on her cell phone. These poor children must be drugged or part of some kind of cult, she thought to herself silently. "If you don't give me your parents' number, I'm going to call the police," she said sternly this time, in hopes of some kind of response. "You let us in, and we're not going anywhere," the little girl said with the same blank, unblinking poker face. Jennifer quickly went to dial 911, and, to her absolute shock, her phone went dead. She didn't understand. It had full battery power only moments ago. She turned to her laptop and watched in panic as the screen flickered several times before going completely blank. Jennifer turned to the little girl, which gave her the same stone-faced gaze. "You're a nice lady. Thank you for letting us in. You belong to us now," the girl said without emotion. Jennifer took off running to the landline of the cabin and began punching in the emergency numbers, only to find it too had gone completely dead. Breathing heavily, she turned to look at the two children, when suddenly the cabin lights began to flicker as well. The heavy fog rolled in deeper. The sky became more overcast, and Jennifer realized it had become dark as night outside. The entire place began to rattle, and Jennifer made a mad dash for the bedroom, slamming the door hard behind her and leaning against it for protection against these strange beings. It was then that the lights went out completely, and Jennifer let out a terrified scream. "You cannot hide from us," the little girl said from behind her, and Jennifer turned to see the children were now in the room with her somehow, standing at the opposite end. Screaming again, she ran back into the living room, stumbling on the footstool as she went and landing hard on the cold wood floor. "Please leave me alone," she screamed, trying to pull herself up in the pitch-black darkness. It was then that bright white lights began to appear outside of the cabin windows, the kind you would expect to see in a UFO movie. They swirled as though a large group of people were holding flashlights, flailing them wildly and circling about the cabin. The lights had such intensity that they were blinding at times, and Jennifer's eyes struggled to adjust. Jennifer began to cry and scream with pleas for them to stop. A harsh, burning pain scraped down her back, like massive claws, and she could feel the back of her sweater fill with some kind of sticky wetness. It was in this moment that she ran feverishly for the front door, grabbing her keys off the side table where she had always left them. The same searing pain she felt on her back now clawed at her entire body, her arms and shoulders especially, as she fought like a wildcat to get away. Her strength was more than she knew she had, and in a rush of adrenaline at this realization, she managed to escape out the front door. Bounding through the heavy snow, practically crawling at times, she finally made it to the driver's side door. The strange, wild lights were actually orbs, floating and swirling in the darkness. They appeared to have no source, flying about as though each had a mind of its own. As Jennifer made it into her vehicle, she saw the children walking on top of the snow towards her. "Go away!" she screamed, slamming the door. "Please go away!" she cried out again while locking the automatic doors. When the children reached her, the boy knocked gently. "Can we come in? Please, we need your help," he said in a monotone voice, with a blank face and black eyes staring up at her. The little girl adding, "You have to let us in. We can't come in unless you let us in. Please, we need to call our parents." "No!" Jennifer screamed. "No, you cannot come in. You cannot come in. Leave me alone." Just then, the children took a step back, and the strange orb lights had suddenly disappeared. Jennifer was crying hysterically as she fumbled for the keys with bloodied hands. Finally, she was able to start the motor and took off like a bullet down the mountain. Watching in the rearview mirror, the children were left standing there as the heavy clouds began to dissipate overhead and daylight slowly began to shine through. Jennifer slid on ice here and there as she went down the switchbacks like a wild woman, but she didn't care. All she wanted to do was get as far away from that cabin as possible. After a brief visit to the emergency room, and a few stitches later, Jennifer spoke with the police, telling them everything that had occurred. With their assistance, she was able to retrieve her things from the cabin. Though her blood was clearly visible on the white winter snow, not a single footprint, other than hers, could be found. As horrifying as the events that occurred were, Jennifer was on the other side of it all, and, surrounded by friends and loved ones, she realized her true strength. If she could survive such events on her own, she could survive anything. It wasn't long after that Jennifer had made a name for herself as a successful horror author, retelling her story in book form. With this newfound confidence and self-respect, Jennifer gained a new life filled with positive opportunities and great happiness for many years to come. So tell me, my loves, what would you do if a black-eyed child knocked on your door? Would you open it? If so, would you let them in? Please comment down below and join me next week for more fictional stories that are often of actual urban legends and sometimes have historical reference. Have a good night.